In this tutorial, we'll cover 32 versus 64-bit applications. FL Studio is available in both 32 and 64-bit. The difference is all about virtual memory, so let's start there. Virtual memory is the address space available to each application for storing and retrieving program data. Virtual address space is like a postbox number at the post office. Let's say we have 4 digits to number postboxes. With that, you can post 10,000 unique letters in Post Office Box 0 to 9,999. With a 5-digit code, you can post 100,000 letters in Box 0 to 99,999. Now imagine rather than postboxes, the numbers point to locations in memory where data can be stored. Following this principle, computers work in binary, so a 32-bit number is 2 to the power of 32. A 32-bit program can access 4 gigabytes of data. 64-bit applications, 2 to the power of 64, can theoretically address 16 exabytes of data. That's 16 billion gigabytes. But this was thought too extravagant, so it's currently limited to 8,000 gigabytes. How sad. For digital audio workstation software like FL Studio, memory is mainly used by sample data. Now, here's the point that causes the most confusion. No matter how much RAM, or physical memory you have, this has no effect on the virtual memory available to applications for storing their data. Why is that? If you don't have enough RAM to store data, then the operating system uses a file on your hard drive to extend it. On Windows, this is known as a page file. The catch is, your hard disk or solid-state drive is a lot slower than RAM, so programs slow down when their data spills out of RAM and onto the disk. For music production software, this means an increased likelihood of underruns, audio glitches, when the buffer runs out of data. It's worth emphasising that these virtual memory limits are per program. Each application or process can have its own 2, 4 or 8,000 gigabytes of memory to play with. So what happens when you run out of virtual memory space? This is quite possible with a 32-bit application. Usually, you'll get an error or a crash. 64-bit applications can run out of memory address space too, but in reality it's not going to happen. 8,000 gigabytes is about 13,500 hours, or 1.5 years of CD quality audio data. So does this mean that FL Studio 64-bit can load more samples and audio than FL Studio 32-bit? Well, no. FL Studio 32-bit includes several memory management techniques that allow you to bypass the 32-bit 4GB limitation. They work by loading samples and VST plugins into separate processes, that is, like separate programs running in parallel with FL Studio. So these processes don't add to FL Studio's virtual memory total. The options include bridging plugins from the wrapper here, or using Keep on Disk in the channel and audio clip sampler settings here, and the general settings here. The 32-bit version of FL Studio will even run 64-bit plugins that can take advantage of the total 8 terabytes of 64-bit virtual memory. Okay, all great so far, but while you can access as much memory as a 64-bit application with FL Studio 32-bit, the core FL Studio 32-bit process is still limited to 4 gigabytes. And so, out-of-memory errors can occur when editing very long audio files in Edison, or when the memory management techniques are not used. This won't happen with FL Studio 64-bit. So does it matter if you use FL Studio 32 or 64-bit? We recommend using 32-bit plugins in the 32-bit version and 64-bit plugins in the 64-bit version of FL Studio, as bridging plugins uses some CPU. If you have a large library of 32-bit plugins not available in 64-bit, then we recommend you stick with FL Studio 32-bit. On the other hand, if you're working with very large sample libraries and multi-gigabytes of audio clips, then FL Studio 64-bit is the best one to use. Of course, if you're on Windows 32-bit, then you'll have to use FL Studio 32-bit. Windows 64-bit will run both 32 and 64-bit versions of FL Studio. So there you have it. Your RAM does not limit how many gigabytes of samples or plugins you can load. The memory bit depth of the program or plugin does. FL Studio 32-bit can use just as much memory and RAM as FL Studio 64-bit, but it needs some tricks to do so. Finally, stick to using mostly 32-bit plugins in FL Studio 32-bit and mostly 64-bit plugins in FL Studio 64-bit. Until next time, enjoy your virtual memory.